Brazilian Portuguese is hands down the most vibrant language on earth. We all know that. It's the language of Samba, Bossa Nova, Carnaval, and many other sensory delights. But how did a tiny language from Europe become a sensational supergiant on a completely different continent? Well, I'm glad you asked, because you're about to learn the story of this incredible language, including what it sounded like in 1822. Turn off your other music. Brazil is in the house. When the apple fell from the original Portuguese tree, the one in Portugal, it rolled so far away that it grew up to become a very different creature from its parent, with its own unique personality.
Tenho 32 anos, sou do Brasil, do interior de São Paulo, mas faz 14 anos que eu vivo no Paraná, onde eu fui estudar.
And who knew when Portuguese left Europe, it would become the most widely spoken language in the entire southern hemisphere? That is right, Portuguese is the 6th most spoken language in the world, and the official language of one particularly enormous country, Brazil. But like all beautiful things, the parents, well, the mother in particular, had something to do with it, and Portugal was the first of 4 life-changing things that shaped the modern Brazilian dialect. So what were those 4 things that shaped Brazilian Portuguese?
Chegou muito fremosa, e muito bem vestida, e entrou no pátio a pé.
In the beginning, there was Latin, and Latin ruled Europe. It started as a tiny language in Italy, but the Romans got hold of it, and when they began to conquer everything around them, they spread Latin far and wide, including to Portugal. Of course, it wasn't called Portugal back then. It was the territories of Galicia or Galicia and Lusitania, and people spoke a Celtic Galician language and Lusitanian. A lot of stuff there. These ancient Celtics and Lusitanian dialects mixed with Vulgar Latin, and then some strange invader languages went into the pot. And what do we end up with? Well, that's Portuguese. A very brief story, I know, but you get the picture. In the year 1500, when the first Portuguese explorers set sail for Brazil, they would take this language with them. But as you'll see later in the story, not all of these explorers were speaking Portuguese. When Brazil was found by the explorers from Portugal, led by Pedro Álvares Cabral, there were already more than 1,000 different languages being spoken there by various indigenous groups, but they had no idea of the size of the place that they'd just found. In fact, the first name given to Brazil by the Europeans should give you a clue. It was called Ilha de Vera Cruz, or Vera Cruz Island. To the natives, it was Pindorama, which means land of palm trees. And obviously, it was no island. All along the seaside, the locals were communities of Tupi-Guarani people who spoke mostly variations of the Tupi language. The biggest group was the Tupinamba, so their language is what the Portuguese mainly came into contact with. They wanted to be able to communicate with these natives, so they started to learn their language, and before long, a lingua franca had developed. It was basically Tupi words with a Portuguese flavour, and they called it Lingua Brasilica, and everyone spoke it to communicate. But there were more influences coming. In fact, the whole picture is quite remarkable. But before I get to that part of the story, I think you'll like this. The Tupi influence was so great that today a massive amount of words of Tupi origin are still part of Brazilian vocabulary, and many Brazilians don't even realise this. Take a look. Abacaxi, which means pineapple, comes from iba and cachi, meaning fruit which smells pleasant and intense. I mean, that's pineapple, isn't it? Most of the words taken from Tupi are related to fishing, hunting, plants, and animal names. But did you know that 13 of Brazil's 26 states have Tupian names, like Roraima, which means green mountain, and Ceará, which means the song of the Jandaia parakeet, a tropical bird native to the area. Isn't that lovely? Not that every place got an awesome name, though. Who knew that Brazil's iconic Ipanema beach in Rio actually means worthless water in Tupi? Why? Well, I have no idea. If you know the answer to that, let me know in the comments. Portuguese, though, also has many Tupian words relating to society, and even some Tupian expressions.
Quero uma cumbuca de açaí e suco de caju. Estou na maior pindaíba, não tenho dinheiro para nada. Os cariocas comem muita tapioca.
Many of these ended up in Portuguese dictionaries, but far fewer words than were actually being used back then. And the influence went both ways, so you can just try to imagine how far Portuguese words spread once they started showing up in the indigenous languages. Of course, Brazil, well, it's massive, and these days most Tupi words are only used regionally, so how many you're likely to hear in Brazil, that will depend on where you go. Tupi also influenced Portuguese grammar a little bit, which is a contentious subject, but I'll prove my claim later. And if you want to hear more of my outrageous claims, well, simply like and subscribe to my channel. I cover all sorts of fascinating topics on languages. Better turn on notifications too, so you don't miss the most controversial ones. In 1549, Jesuit missionaries landed on the Brazilian beaches, and as things go, they also influenced the languages. It's quite a phenomenon, really. Like the others, they also learned the Língua Brasílica, or Língua Geral Amazônica, as the northern variety was called. But the Jesuits were well educated in Latin grammar, and so they wrote down the Língua Brasílica that they found, and they gave it some structure. The interesting thing is that even indigenous Brazilians or of different tribes started speaking Língua Geral to understand one another. Can you picture this? By 1595, it was the most spoken language on the Brazilian coast. So what happened to the northern variety, the Língua Geral Amazônica? Something very interesting, actually. Stay tuned to find out. By the way, if you have your sights set on Brazil and you want to learn Brazilian Portuguese, well, I am thrilled to announce the launch of my Story Learning Brazilian Portuguese course. It is called Story Learning because, well, you learn Portuguese through the power of story, in exactly the same way that you do with my books of short stories, except this course is for beginners. It's a comprehensive program that teaches you to learn and speak Brazilian Portuguese, and it's very different to regular methods because the entire course is built around a story, which means you learn in a much more natural, in-depth way. Exactly the same way that you learn your native language as a child, through story. You know, many people tell me that the first time they visit Brazil, they are super excited to be there, and they've even studied a bit of Portuguese beforehand, but when they arrive, they just can't understand the locals because they speak so quickly, and that ends up sort of spoiling the whole experience for them. Well, Portuguese Uncovered, this new course, is the perfect way to build up to being able to understand Brazilians, because the whole story learning methodology is based on being able to understand. It's about comprehension, because not only does that make it far easier to understand people, but it's also far easier to join in conversations later and speak yourself when you can understand already what is going on. Now, the course is coming out really very soon, and by the time you watch this video, it may already be out. So for more information, there's a link in the description. Click that link. That will take you to the place where you can find out more. Which brings us to the next fascinating influence on Brazilian Portuguese. Now, starting around 1550, the Portuguese began to trade African slaves to work the sugar plantations in Bahia, Pernambuco, Rio de Janeiro, and a few other areas. They mostly came from Benin, Nigeria, and Angola, and later Mozambique. These people spoke Bantu and West African languages like Kimbundu and Yoruba, but there were many other ethnicities among them, including Arabs and Berbers. So did they also have to learn the Língua Geral? Well, you bet they did. And then this rainbow of African languages gave hundreds of words to the growing Portuguese dialect, like musical terms, samba, lundu, machixe, berimbau. Capoeira is another word from West Africa. It's a Brazilian martial art. You've seen it on TV. You know, the one with violent kicks that were disguised as dance movements. And it's a very important part of the culture of Brazil. Here are a few more of the many words from Africa.
Zumbi, neném, pinga, matuto, babá, babaca, banguela, bagunça, fofoca, lero-lero, tagarela, zoeira.
Do you hear that nasally sound coming through there? Well, here's something that not everybody knows. Although Portuguese already had nasal vowels and diphthongs, Kimbundu was very heavy on those nasal sounds, so it most likely fixed those sounds in Brazilian Portuguese and made them even richer.
Mbwa. Mbwa. Mbwa.
There's also this advogado. Advogado. Do you hear that G in the middle? The G? Compare that to the spelling you see here. See, Portuguese tries to avoid what are called consonant clusters, so putting two or more consonants together. And this way of adding a vowel sound in between consonants, advo, like that, is an immigrants and locals. I mean, at this point in our story, people were arriving all along the coast of Brazil. And can you blame them? I mean, look at this place. So there actually ended up being a few creolized languages. There was the Língua Geral Paulista, spoken around São Paulo, and another form in Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Espírito Santo. Everyone was speaking similar lingua francas, which is quite amazing, huh?
Sia mira tau purandu isharan. Marantare putare purungitanya ngatu. Aputayanye penyaran maranta.
In the 17th century, Língua Geral Amazônica was properly standardized by the Jesuits. They used the vocabulary and pronunciation of the Tupinambá and grammar based on the original Portuguese. Doesn't it sound cool? Well, for 200 years, this is what most people spoke. Now, earlier I asked you if you know what happened to this language in the end. Well, here's a clue. It still exists, and if you know where, let me know in the comments. As for the Língua Geral Paulista, the one from São Paulo, well, one fine day, a group of nomadic explorers and warriors called bandeirantes entered the jungle in search of gold and native slaves. They were mostly mixed-race descendants of the Europeans and indigenous people, and they spread this variety of language all the way up the jungle. But what happened when ordinary immigrants started arriving from Portugal? Well, I'll tell you, they needed translators until they could understand their own ancestors. But like in all good stories, things were about to take a dramatic turn. Now, the year is 1822, and this is how imperial Brazilian Portuguese would have sounded.
Levantou-se, pois, e foi buscar a seu pai. E quando ele ainda vinha longe, viu o seu pai, que ficou movido de compaixão, e correndo, lançou-lhe os braços ao pescoço para o abraçar e o beijou.
If you're from Brazil, you might have grandparents who still speak a little bit like this, but a little before this time, in 1750, an important diplomat called the Marquis of Pombal arrived in Brazil with orders to force Paulista schools to teach the children Portuguese. If they didn't obey, well, they were punished. You see, the Portuguese monarch had decided to create a national identity that would differ from the surrounding Spanish colonies, and the impact of that was going to be huge. The Marquis expelled the Jesuit missionaries who had taught Língua Geral that we heard about earlier, and prohibited everyone from speaking it. From now on, it was Portuguese only, and so sadly, Língua Geral Paulista became extinct. But it left Portuguese packed full of new words and rhythms. So by the end of the 18th century, Portuguese was the national language now, and in the 1800s, the number of Portuguese speakers in Brazil, well, it boomed massively. In 1822, Brazil won their independence from Portugal, and what a day! The traffic of slaves started slowing down, and in 1888, Princess Isabel made it official. Slavery was abolished. From then on, many European immigrants, Germans, Italians, Japanese, started arriving in the country in happy days. As the story goes, Italians didn't just bring in new words through film and music, they had a strong influence on the pronunciation as well in São Paulo. So, not surprising, at one point, half of São Paulo was Italian. So, let's answer this question now. What happened to the Língua Geral Amazônica, that northern variety?
Makuru Swashari. Paia. Qua Kayueta Panye Kusauishe Puraki Indeara Mane Manameshe Desobedecer Inde.
Well, it is now a language called Niingatu, and it's spoken by about 30,000 people in the Amazonas state, in the Brazilian Amazon, and in parts also of Colombia and Venezuela. As for Brazilian Portuguese, well, from the beginning of the 1900s, it eventually became its own thing, and it has some really beautiful words and expressions of its own. The most iconic, of course, being the one that everyone talks about, saudade. Now, saudade is a word for a sad state of intense longing for someone or something that is absent. People, places, things, moments. Something beautiful in your life that is not there right now. That's what saudade means. Now, a lot of people are going to mistranslate it as, I miss you. To miss something, in reality, it's much deeper and richer than that. I like the way that one writer described the word saudade. He described it as, I'll miss living in your light. Saudade. Saudade de você. I will miss living in your light. Yeah. Maybe now you can see why I love this language so much. In fact, didn't I, Yeah, we'll leave that in the depths of YouTube, I think, for people who really want to go digging to find Anyway, by the middle of the 20th century, Portuguese had strongly diverged into various regional accents, and some French and American English terms crept in as well. But because the world is a complex place, back across the Atlantic in Portugal, well, there's actually been some reverse influence from Brazil back to Portugal. See, after Brazil's Independence Day in 1822, a lot of immigrants actually went back to Portugal, and with them, a whole bunch of Brazilian language, idioms and expressions. But is that all?
Descoberto o segredo de Rita, que se faz passar por Nina.
The phenomenon of the Brazilian telenovela, they are huge in Portugal, so there you go. And never underestimate the power of, well, trashy TV. Today, Brazil is by far the world's largest Portuguese-speaking nation, and the only one in the Americas. Brazilian Portuguese has around 200 million speakers, and people are an astonishingly diverse mix of descendants from every one of the ethnicities that I've mentioned in the video so far. And something really interesting happened not so long ago. In 1990, an organisation called the Community of Portuguese Language Countries was created. Now, they wanted to unify the spelling used by Brazil on one side and the remaining Portuguese-speaking countries on the other. The spelling reform went into effect in Brazil on the 1st of January 2009, and it's been in force since January 2016. For example, before 1990, Brazil used certain diacritics like the U umlaut in words like these, but no other Portuguese countries spelled these words like this. But now, everyone has to leave those diacritics out. Everyone. Not from all words, it's just been made uniform. Brazilian spelling also leaves out the silent letters C and P, whereas other Portuguese countries write those silent letters, and now those silent letters are omitted in all dialects. It's quite drastic, isn't it? This one's funny. They've added 3 letters to the Portuguese alphabet. That's right, K, W and Y are the new kids in Portuguese town. Why though? Well, they said they're trying to make it easier for the whole world to understand Portuguese content, like internet searches will be easier, for example, if there's only one way to spell a Portuguese word. The countries were only given 6 years to make these changes to everything. Do you think people were happy about that? Well, not so much. Kids in schools were being taught the new spellings, but they were still seeing the old spellings around them in the streets and in magazines and so on. Sorry, kids.
Alvorada começa a cantar, com satisfação arreio o burrão, cortando o estradão saio a galopar, e vou escutando o gado berrando e o sabiá cantando no Jequitibá.
Any guesses where this dialect is from? The Caipira Brazilian Portuguese dialect is a rather peculiar dialect spoken in the rural areas in and around São Paulo, and it is pretty fascinating. It has some archaic sounds because it was influenced by the Galician-Portuguese. Yes, there were Galicians on those ships too, and their language mixed with the Língua Geral Paulista. In the 1920s, Caipira's death was predicted, but the rural people kept it alive with their music and folk stories. So if you wander into the right places, you can still hear it being spoken.
Quando a gente veio morar aqui, é painho, mainha, oxente. Oxe, painho, o que você tá fazendo? É assim.
This cool dialect is Baianos from Bahia. They even have their own dictionary, the Dicionário de Baianês. It is also the birthplace of Samba and Capoeira, so quite a big deal, but there are many more varieties. Brazil, well, it's enormous, so it's hardly surprising. These are the 16 main ones. The most common in the media are from Rio and from Sao Paulo, and even so, it's perfectly possible for a Brazilian to understand the different dialect from the other end of the country. If you're fascinated by this gorgeous language, you could even visit the Museum of the Portuguese Language in São Paulo. It is very cool and the only museum in the world entirely dedicated to a language. A Brazilian linguist once said, it's kind of long, but bear with me, there are 2 languages in Brazil. The one we write, which is called Portuguese, and another one that we speak. The latter is the mother tongue of Brazilians, and the former, one you write, has to be learned in school. Our mother tongue is not Portuguese, but Brazilian vernacular. Now, what do you think of this statement, guys? Well, I'll tell you what I think of Brazilian Portuguese. In fact, I'll tell you exactly how I learned Portuguese and all the crazy things that happened to me when I went to Brazil, including hanging out with some of the biggest music stars on the planet. Well, in Brazil, anyway. It's all over here in this video, so go and watch that right now.